welcome to the first class. So we're going to be talking about GMOs. And right there on the very top, that's the resolution. That's what you're expected to debate about. So resolved, debate resolution, so always start with resolved. And TH means this house. This house here we're going to be discussing. S is support. So this house supports mandatory GMO labeling. So we have to understand what GMOs are. We have to understand why labeling is important. And also we have to understand why it should be mandatory. So do you know what that word means, mandatory?
A policy?
It is a policy. It is a policy. So what does it involve?
I know it's a policy. My parents sometimes talk about it with me, but I can't quite remember.
Okay, so when we say mandatory, it means you have to. You're required to. What happens if you don't?
Then you get like sued or something?
You get in trouble. You get in trouble because it's a law. So the government will say you have to put a label on a food package if it contains GM material. And if you don't put that label there, when the law is asking you to do that, then you can either get fined, or in serious cases, maybe they can imprison somebody. But that rarely happens. In most cases, it'll be you being fined, or they take away your license where you can't make food anymore, or something like that. So when we're saying, hey, we want to make it mandatory so that GMOs are labeled, that means anybody who makes any food package, any food stuff that includes GM material, then they have to put it on their label, the box with a label, this food package contains GM food, okay? So if you're on the pro side, you're saying, yes, we want mandatory labeling of GM foods. If you're on the con side, you're saying, no, we can't have it mandatory. That's going too far. So I don't agree with this policy. Does that make sense? Okay. So we're going to watch a few clips, but before I do, show you that, I'm just going to briefly go over these lines here. So the key word that you have to understand is mechanized monoculture. Mechanized monoculture. So mechanized means using machines. Okay, using machines. Can you guess what monoculture is? Now let me give you a hint. Okay? Agriculture means farming. You're growing crops. Aquaculture means you're growing fish, or you're raising fish. Because you can have like a pool or a pond, and you can raise fish. So that's aquaculture. Agriculture is you're growing crops, like farming. What do you think monoculture is? What is mono? It means one. So monoculture means you're only growing one type of crop. One type of crop. Okay? And because you're growing one type of crop, you're using machines. Okay? So far so good? So before we had these big machines to plow the field, throw in the seeds, water it, harvest it, all of that was done manually by people. But you can't do acres and acres or acres of land if you're just relying upon human labor. Why? Because you can only do so much. So when people decided, I want to have a bigger lot, I'm only going to grow one type, and I don't want to be limited by human manual labor, because it's hard, first of all, and it takes forever. It's easier to use machines. So just drive a big tractor and then do whatever you need to do, right? So that's what it means by mechanized monoculture. Now, what you have to understand is that before we had this mechanized monoculture scenario, which is kind of the standard practice now. This is what everybody's doing now. So if you go to a field, you rarely see a bunch of people on the field growing crops, harvesting, or doing anything like that. It's just one person with a big machine going around the field, okay? Before we had this mechanized monoculture, 58% of the population were farmers. So of 10 people, 6 people were farmers. Wrap that around, okay? Now, it's only 2%. It's probably less than that. So out of 100 people, back in the day when we didn't have this mechanized monoculture scenario, it was 58 people out of 100 were farmers. Now we only have 2 farmers of 100 people, okay? Back in the late 18th century, an average farmer, 58%, would feed around 6 to 8 people. One farmer feeds 6 to 8 people. Now, one farmer feeds 126. So less farmers, but you got more people, but you gotta pump up the production. You gotta harvest so that people can eat it. What do? You use machines. Now, if you have many different types of crops, you can't use machines, or it's very hard to use machines. Only if you have one type, then it's much easier for the farmer using machines, okay? Human labor is replaced with mechanized labor or machine labor, right? Setting the conditions for monoculture, okay? Better the equipment, better the yields, the more you harvest, and led to the formation of large businesses, large farming businesses. So before it was like a family thing. Like I have my little land, and then I bring in my family members and my friends and stuff like that, and then we would farm together. But most of them required human labor. So I have to physically go into the field, I have to plant it, do whatever, water it, harvest it, and come back. Maybe you use tools, but they didn't use machines, these big tractors, okay? But once you introduce these big tractors and big machines, then you can have bigger fields. So the bigger the field, the bigger the machine, the more crops you get. So that would aggregate, and they would merge together and would form one big company. Does that make sense? Okay. Now what you have to understand is that monoculture separates livestock. What is livestock? Do you know what that is? Animals. Farming animals. Now before we had mechanized monoculture, it was you have a piece of land for farming, and on the same lot, on the same farm, you have another piece of land for livestock. And the reason why this was important was because the livestock, they would eat and poop, right? And it's called manure. So the livestock manure would be used to replenish nutrients back into the crop field. All right? So something you have to understand is that when you have a field, let's say you're growing corn, okay? Let's say you're growing corn. In that corn field, you have things you have to worry about. Number one, you may see some weeds, unwanted plants shooting up from the field. Is that something that you want, yes or no? Why not?
They take away sunlight.
They take away sunlight, okay, cool. And what else? What do you think?
Water.
Water. Space. Very good. But also, they also take away nutrients from the soil. In the soil, you need to have nutrients. And those nutrients need to go to the crop that you want to sell, the corn, not to the weeds. So farmers, they have to kill the weeds by spraying what's called herbicides. Okay? And that's one type of a biocide. Biocide means to kill. You're killing live things. You're killing bio. So if you're killing weeds, it's herbicide because you're killing herbs. Now also, you have something called pesticides.
I did this project on that.
So what is pesticides then?
It gets rid of like pests, like
bugs. So if you have a corn crop and a bug comes in and eats, a part of your crop, is that good or bad for the farmer? Why is that bad?
Because if that can get like bad stuff in it, and also the crop won't have as much.
Won't have as much as what?
Of like its like if it eats some of the crop, you don't have as much to produce.
Okay, okay. But also you have to think about in terms of, I want to sell this product. If you're selling it in the marketplace, as a consumer, as a customer, do you want to buy a corn that has bite marks all over, or do you want a nice clean cob? Nice clean one. So for a farmer, they don't like pests, they don't like bugs coming in and eating their crop. So that's another problem. So they have to spray pesticides. So you have to spray pesticides to get rid of the bugs. Yeah.
Let's say you have, can you like use tractors to spread pesticides?
Yes, yes.
You can.
Yeah. That's why they want to use these machines. Because if you have acres and acres of land, you're not going to be using, or you're not going to be spraying that with your hands. You're going to be driving around the tractor to spray whatever you spray. Whether it's herbicides killing the weeds, or pesticides killing the bugs. But also remember, there are nutrients on the soil. So every time you have harvest, then the crops suck up all the nutrients from the soil. So you have to replenish the soil with nutrients. And that's called fertilizer. So you fertilize the soil. Why? Because the crops need the nutrients. But also you want to spray herbicides. Why? Because you want to get rid of the weeds. And you also want to spray pesticides. Why? Because you want to get rid of the bugs. Okay? With fertilizer though, and pesticides and herbicides for that matter, there are two types. One is organic version, where you make it with organic material. Another version is artificial or chemical version, where you make it with gas or petroleum, oil, so basically. Okay? Which one do you think is cheaper, the organic version or the chemical version? Chemical version. So if you're doing monoculture and you have a big piece of land, you're using tractors, you're not using organic fertilizers, you're not using organic pesticides or herbicides, you're using chemical pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers. Why? Because it's cheaper. Okay? Now, remember when I told you monoculture separates livestock. Why is this important? When you had livestock, you would take the manure, the dung from the animals, and you would compost it, meaning that you lay it so that it breaks down, and once you leave it for a long enough period, it breaks down, and then you can use it as soil. And you put it back into, it doesn't stink like dung anymore, because it's all decomposed. So you spray it back into the field, and that becomes fertilizer. You're replenishing the nutrients back into the field by taking the cow dung and then composting it and then putting it back into the field. And that was organic fertilizer. So before you had these mechanized machine monoculture, for a regular, traditional, organic farming operation, you have crops on the one side, animals on the other side. You take the cow dung, put it back into the soil so that you get better crops, and whatever you have, you feed it back into the animals, and it was a symbiotic circle. But with machine mechanized monoculture, you don't have that system anymore. You separate now. One side you have big lots of corn monoculture, and the other side you have big lots of animal farming operations. So a big lot just dedicated to raise cows. Okay. Now this creates problem. Number one, you now have waste. When you had cow dung in the same lot as your crops, you welcome that dung. Why? Because it was fertilizer. You're going to use it back and replenish the nutrients back into the soil. But if you don't have the crop farm and the animal farm in one lot, then you just created waste because you make use of that cow dung. And taking care of that is a big issue. Also, nutritional insufficiency. Remember when the dung was used to replenish the soil, but you don't have that situation anymore, so you have to buy fertilizer so that you can put the nutrients back in. So when you had a situation where animal farming and regular crop farming was in one lot, they would help each other out. But because you separated them, now you have waste in terms of cow dung on the other side. And the other side of town, where they're growing monoculture, they're now having nutritional insufficiency. You don't have enough nutrition. So that's a problem. Let's see. We'll get to this part later. But now I think, so that's a rough primer. So you understand now that the standard way of farming is not through people, manual labor. It's using what? Mechanized, so means using what?
Machines.
Machines. And because you're using machines, you can't grow a wide variety of crops. You can only grow one type, which is why it's called monoculture. Okay, so far so good. So now we're going to watch a quick clip. There were two clips that we played. The first one was this one right here, Michael Pollan's Food Rules. It's like a 2-minute clip. And then the second one that we watched was this, Eye of Nye, from Bill Nye the Science Guy. I mean, just looking at the clip, it's pretty old, 2005, but it's still relevant. That's why I played it. Now, Bill Nye, just looking at this particular episode, he's kind of worried, he's kind of concerned. He wants us to be more responsible. He wants us to be a little bit more, more informed about the dangers or the potential concerns of GMOs. But he kind of, now he's on the stance, he's like, I think we're good. GMOs are fine. So back then, maybe he was a little bit more concerned. Now he's like, we're fine. But, that's just him. Not to say that everybody else is like that. Now, what you want to take away from what he just said was, remember that a lot of it is going to feed livestock, but it's not just feeding livestock. It's also going to your cereal. It's also going to your soft drinks. And if you buy, let's say, Coca-Cola from the U.S., if you flip around the can with what's in the ingredients, then you will see something called high fructose corn syrup. So they'll put corn syrup made from corn, to add as sweetener. Why? Because you want to put sugar. So before the original formula, they included sugar. But why would they change sugar, or why would they replace sugar and put in corn syrup? What do you think?
Because it's been genetically modified?
Well, yeah, that's obviously the kind of the case, or that is what I'm trying to get at. But why would the Coca-Cola company decide to make that transition? Why would they use corn syrup instead of using sugar?
Because it helps other businesses.
Okay, yes, it helps with the business. How? What do you think?
Like, it gives them more money.
More money.
Than just buying sugar.
Sure. So, which is cheaper, sugar or corn syrup? Corn syrup is cheaper. So it's cheaper to produce a can of Coke by adding in corn syrup instead of sugar. Now, why is this relevant? Or there's a concrete example. I went to school in Texas, and Texas shares a border with what country? Mexico. In Mexico, sugar is cheaper than corn syrup. So in the Mexican Coke, they don't put in corn syrup. They just put in sugar. So if you go to Costco, like in Texas, then you have two types. You have the Mexican variety and the US variety. And the Mexican version is more expensive, but it's still on the shelves. Why? Because people prefer the taste of sugar rather than corn syrup. I, for one, thought it tasted better. So the same Coke, same Coca-Cola with the same formula, but depending on where you're making it, in one country it's going to be cheaper to buy sugar and put it in, and in another country it's cheaper to buy corn syrup and put it in. And now you have two different versions, one made from Mexico, one made from the US. And the US version would have corn syrup, and the Mexican version will have sugar cane. I, for one, thought the sugar version tasted better.
I've never tried Mexican version.
It's pretty good. It's It's pretty good.
I might ask my parents.
Okay.
I think they're not a huge fan of Coke.
Yes, I mean, I'm not saying you should be drinking that, but I'm just saying if there was a chance for you to try both versions, maybe you can just see if there is a difference or not. Some people may say, I don't taste the difference. It tastes the same to me. For me, I was like, there is a clear difference, and I thought this was better. Not to say that I love drinking Coke. I kind of don't anymore, but well, back in college days, I used to. Like, I would go to McDonald's and buy Coke and stuff like that. Now, what you also have to understand is that corn is one of the main crops that are grown by using a GM variety. So a GMO corn consists of like 95% of all the corn that you're eating. So if you're eating corn, and unless it says it's organic, then most likely you're eating GM corn. Okay? What else do you make with corn? So you can feed it to animals. You can make syrup out of it. There's another major ingredient that you eat. Let me give you a hint. So yeah, you can eat corn on the cob, or you can eat popcorn and stuff like that. But also, similar to syrup, they will extract the oil. So you use it for cooking oil. So when you're eating fried chicken, they need to have buckets and buckets of cooking oil to fry the chicken. Does that make sense? So whatever is cheaper, the producers will prefer. So if you're like, let's say you run a big fried chicken chain, do you want to fry your chickens with organic oil, or you want to fry your chickens with GMO corn oil? Which one is cheaper?
Well, I mean, I would probably do the less cheap one, the more cheap one.
The more cheaper version.
Because then everyone will be like, oh yeah, they don't have GMOs, and I can get more customers. But it depends on what I would give the price.
Right. Everything comes at the price. So if you make your fried chicken using expensive ingredients, then the asking price has to be higher. But if you use cheaper ingredients, then you can lower the price and say, we got good prices, we got low prices. Especially if you're running a fast food joint, then you want to make it as cheap as possible. So McDonald's, they would sell $1 cheeseburgers. You buy a cheeseburger with buns and a patty and a slice of cheese with their sauce, maybe some pickles, stuff like that, and it's sold for $1. So how much does it cost them to make one, first of all? And they have to go all the way to where you're at, and all that price is included, and what you have to pay for is $1. Okay? Now, do you think they can do that using expensive ingredients? No. So you have to get your meat, your buns, your everything in the most cheapest, the most lowest price point possible, so that you can sell it to your customers at the lowest price point possible. Does that make sense?
I've never really experienced getting like a low price. The problem is I'm allergic to like wheat, barley, rye, so I don't really get that cheap experience. Like I've never been to McDonald's in my life.
Good for you. Good for you.
And like most fast food places, my sister's like, "Ooh, can we go there?" And then my mom's like, "No, I can't."
Yeah, I have kids myself, and I don't feed them any fast food. I wouldn't. Even though I had them, I wouldn't feed them to my kids. And there's a big difference between what I ate. So when I was your age, because McDonald's existed then, the McDonald's that existed and the Big Mac that they sold when I was your age is completely different from the version that you're eating now. So it's the same Big Mac, maybe the price is roughly the same, but what's in there is different. Same thing for Coca-Cola. So know that these GM foods, why did they make it? Why did they make these GM varieties in the first place? Because it's cheaper. You get more production, you get to harvest more, and it's cheaper to produce, so you can make more of it, and you can make use of it more. That's the whole deal. Okay, so you have to understand it. So first, the corn usage, 32% goes to export, selling it to other countries, and also making ethanol, which is like a biofuel. So they try to convert corn into fuel that you can put into your car. It's not really happening, but they had a fad. They had a time where they really wanted that to happen. 5% is going to high fructose corn syrup, the thing that they put in your fuzzy drinks. And 55% goes to livestock. Okay? Glyphosate is the chemical compound that they use to spray on the GM crops. Why? Because they want to get rid of the weeds. Okay? They want to get rid of the weeds. And for corn and soy, in 1995, they sprayed 5,000 tons. In 1998, they sprayed 10,000 tons. In 2003, they sprayed 30,000 tons. 2010, they sprayed 80,000 tons. So 2021, is this number likely to go up or down?
Up.
Way up. Way up. Now, why is this important?
Well, because, like, that's a lot of, like, facility stuff.
So if you think glyphosate is perfectly fine to use, then you're gonna say, what's the big deal? What's the big deal? We're trying to get rid of the weeds, and as long as we're doing that, then it's doing its job.
Yeah.
Now, yeah.
I have like, if, I think, do they experiment with a little bit or more?
What do you mean?
Like, so this has like probably like 5,000 tons. How much would you say every piece of corn has?
I don't know exactly how much of that is sprayed to individual crops,
Okay.
but it would be very hard to, I guess, do that, to calculate that. But I think they're just trying to give you an understanding of
Yeah.
of the fact that we're spraying more and more. Why? Because we're growing more and more.
No, and like I bet they experiment with people or animals specifically. But the problem is, like, they probably do a little bit. And once it comes to a lot, that might have effects. They probably do a little bit, then a little bit more, and it gets to medium, and then you're done. But it never goes to large.
Another issue you have to think about is, let's say you did an experiment. You found that there's nothing to worry about. You didn't see any immediate bad effects. But what if there was a lag? What if you don't get the effects right away, and you have to wait a few months or a few years? And as you said, it has to accumulate. So for a small little exposure, no big deal. But in time, it compounds every year, little by little. And once it, accumulates to a certain level, then you see the effects. What happens then? That's another issue. But why is glyphosate important? Right now, it's perfectly legal to use glyphosate. Right now, it's perfectly legal. There's nothing wrong with it legally. Okay? It's sold in gardening shops. It's sold to farmers, and they're saying this is the chemical compound that will kill your weeds. And you need this. Why? Because you don't want the weeds on your farm. Now, before glyphosate was the main thing, was the mainstream product, you had something called DDT. DDT was the product or the chemical compound that was used prior to glyphosate. Why did glyphosate replace DDT? Was because in 1972, EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency, this is a US government agency, they banned it. They said you can't use this anymore in 1972. Why? Because they found out that it causes cancer. So DDT was widely used as an insecticide, pesticide, or herbicide for that matter, on farmlands, on gardens, at home, anywhere. And the government would promote it. They would say, DDT is good for me. Go ahead and spray away. No worries. Only to find out that, whoa, this causes cancer, so yeah, we're gonna ban it now. So it's possible for the government to say, hey, you're fine, don't worry, use it. And then at some point, it's like, oop, sorry, turns out, yeah, you don't want to be using this. So we're going to ban it. Now, why is this relevant? This chemical doesn't break apart. It doesn't decompose. So you still have traces of it in the soil and on the water, even today. So when everybody was using it, it didn't break, the chemical didn't break apart, didn't decompose. So you still see traces left even today. But they had to ban it because they later realized it causes cancer. So after DDT was banned, you needed another type of pesticides or herbicides to get rid of the weeds. So that's where glyphosate came.
When was DDT invented?
I'm not sure exactly, but it was widely used. There's a precursor to DDT, which was actually a war weapon. So what it was they used it to get rid of foliage or trees or leaves where they thought the enemy was hiding. So DDT is a watered down version of a chemical, chemical warfare weapon called Agent Orange. Agent Orange. So, and they probably had DDT before that, but in the Vietnam War, when the U.S. was fighting, the Viet Cong, they would the Vietnamese soldiers, they would hide under the bushes, and they would ambush the U.S. troops. And the U.S. troops were like, we can't have these guys just ambush us hiding in the trees. So what we're going to do is we're going to spray Agent Orange on the forest and get rid of all the leaves. And it got rid of everything. But it also got rid of the people living under the trees, or the animals for that matter. It just basically decimated everything in that area. So once you spray this, you're killing everything. And you still have people who are suffering from the aftermath of Agent Orange. So that's how bad it is. But DDT is a watered down version. So if Agent Orange was used as a weapon, a chemical weapon, now they just add more water to it. I guess the solution is less heavy or less toxic. And they said, hey, just spray away to get rid of the weeds. But that also accumulated. So like you said, if it comes to a point where it just adds up and adds up, then it can get dangerous, and EPA found that out later in 1972 and said, yeah, we're going to ban this because it causes cancer. Now, you have to also understand that before the government banned it, before they said you can't use this anymore, there were people who were concerned about it. And one of that person, or one of a major figure, was a person named Rachel Carson, and she was a scientist in the U.S., and she wrote a book called The Silent Spring, and that book was published in 1963. So 9 years prior to the EPA announcing that don't use this because this causes cancer. 9 years prior, Rachel Carson, the scientist who wrote Silent Spring, she already said this. But she was ridiculed and outcasted for saying that. Said, what do you know? Everybody's using it, the government said it was okay, what do you know? Only to find out later that, oh, actually she was right. So there were people who were concerned about this before the government decided to change their policies. So understand that whatever technology that we are using right now, just because the government says it's okay, doesn't guarantee that it's okay. Does that make sense? You have to get that in there. Not to say that the government is in cohorts with the companies and they know there's something wrong with it, but they're letting it happen anyways because they got bribed. No, I'm not saying that. It can be an honest mistake. It can be a perfectly honest mistake, thinking that, well, we thought it was okay. I mean, we did the test and it looked all right. I mean, but as time goes and as more people use it, they said, well, actually, this is actually more serious than we thought. So they later changed their stance. That happens all the time. So glyphosate, we know we're using more of it. What was the precursor to glyphosate? What was the version that we had before? It was DDT. and it was widely used everywhere. The government promoted it. And people who had concerns about it, they were ridiculed. It's like, what do you know? But EPA later said, yeah, actually this causes cancer, so we can't use this anymore. So that happened. Let's keep that in mind. Also, what you have to understand, because this doesn't biodegrade, because it doesn't break down, it accumulates. It accumulates in the soil and also in the water. It doesn't break down, so it stacks up into the soil and water, and it attaches to your fat cell. So if fish eat something that has traces of DDT in it, because it doesn't break down, the fish has fat cells and it will be attached to the fat cells. And there's going to be a bigger fish eating that little fish. And there's going to be a bigger fish that eats that fish. Who's on the top of the food chain?
Sharks.
Was that?
Sharks.
Well, at the very, very top, who's at the very top of the food chain? We are. So it bioaccumulates to us. Same thing for animals. Whatever you're eating, it doesn't biodegrade, it doesn't break apart. So it'll just be attached to the fat cell. And higher, higher, higher up you go, it accumulates. And whoever's on the very top of the food chain is getting all of that. So that's a concern. That's the concern.